you.
You're good to go. Jump, 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 jump. Yeah, go. We're going to cover it, but let's see how many. Give us a couple seconds here. You know, I found out about the sound. He says it's the way the board is configured.
Okay.
I'm probably.
You can do sound through that.
Yeah, that's going to come tonight.
Okay, yeah. Oh, yeah, what?
Okay, when they get back, I'm going to ask an important question for all of you people here tonight. Except for you, Susan. You're excluded. We do? That's scary. Was it online last week?
No.
Okay. Okay. All right, let me go ahead and pray. Father God, thank you for your grace. Thank you for your son, Jesus. And Lord, thank you for being the one who has all knowledge and is generous enough to give us the opportunity to get to know something about you, about your kingdom, Lord, and about the way we should conduct ourselves. We thank you for this study tonight on C.S. Lewis. May it be glorifying to you. In Christ's name, amen. All right. If you weren't here last week, what we covered was a book called God in the Dock on C.S. Lewis. I don't know if you've read one book of C.S. Lewis's. I don't know if you've read 3 books. Most people have read less than 10 of C.S. Lewis's book. And I would tell you, if there's a book you want to start with, this is the book. And the reason you want to start with this book has a well-documented history of C.S. Lewis's writings, as well as his broadcast. And it covers very, very many topics. And so we're going to talk about 2 of them, have a video on a 3rd one that's a little bit broader. But the reason you want to get this book is, like I said, is it's a way of understanding when you're reading Mere Christianity, when you're reading Screwtape Letters or the Trilogy or anything. This is the thinking of C.S. Lewis in a bunch of articles. I'm going to show you what that looks like, but this is kind of the gateway, if you will. What I'm also doing is giving you access to a video source on C.S. Lewis that I found very helpful in further giving me some understanding about C.S. Lewis and what some of the elements are in his book here. And I said also last week here, if I were on a desert island, there's 3 books I would have, or 3 authors I would have. I'd have the scriptures, of course. I would have C.S. Lewis, and 3rd, but definitely not least, some people give me a hard time because I don't have Machen on the list here, but it would be How Then Shall We Live by, who knows How Then Shall We Live? Francis Schaeffer, okay? So I would have Schaeffer, Lewis, and the scriptures on my desert island that I would be on because I got kicked out of the house or something like that. All right, so that's sort of the background. I've got a handout there if you want, just covering some of the topics we're talking about tonight. But I'm going to ask you guys a question. We got some younger people in the room here. Susan and I are past this stage here. But how many of you either have kids or are planning on having kids? Raise your hand. Okay? Now, what you realize is the education of your kids is critical. If you're already married and have kids, you're probably thinking about how are we going to educate our kids here. Okay? If you're not having kids yet, you're going to have to think about it sometimes. How are we going to educate our kids here? And the reason I bring that up here, the chapter that C.S. Lewis has that we're going to cover tonight on the transmission of Christianity is an important one. And this is the setting here, I'll get to it here, is really in 1940s England, and they're talking about Christian education, the transmission of Christianity, if you will. topics. So we're going to start with the transmission of Christianity. At the request of my pastor and to keep my job, I got to do Bulverism, or the foundation of the 20th century thought. And then we'll do a video from Hillsdale. And this is where I really want, if you guys are really interested in C.S. Lewis, you want to jump onto Hillsdale's online courses, which are completely free, to get an understanding of C.S. Lewis in a very interactive session here. This particular section I'm going to show you tonight here is dealing with enjoyment and contemplation, which references another chapter in his book on what's called meditation in the tool shed. And I found it very enlightening and almost educational to me, because I think sometimes, especially as Reformed people, we can get into observing something and not really enjoying those things, okay? And I think God made us to be joyful people is really the point here. And so you'll see some of those points talked about as we get into the video from Hillsdale. Just going back a little bit here, last week we talked about evil and God. And so there was the video was on that as well, so it was a little bit redundant, but it was just to give you a very good background on C.S. Lewis. You can look here in the part one. Again, this book is divided into 3 parts here. Part one has all of the 23 topics that you see on the screen here. We covered evil and God. I also have, but I'm not going to present, is miracles. That's a very good chapter to read as well. What I did last week is I started off with God in the dock. What does God in the dock really mean here? Now, one of my favorite movies is Prosecution for the Witness. If you ever want to see an old movie to see what a dock looks like from an English perspective here, in that movie they have the courtroom setting, and you see what it's looked like for someone to be in the dock. The accused person or the person being tried is in the dock. And so that's what this book is about here. We are putting God in the dock here, and he has to prove to us why he's innocent, if you will. And so part one, we covered some of the elements there. Part two, we talked about God in the dock, which you can see highlighted there here. These are the 16 topics that are covered. So again, very diverse topics in this book here. It's an easy read, meaning if you want to read about 5 pages here and get an understanding. I will say, if you haven't read C.S. Lewis before, I say that C.S. Lewis is kind of like chewing on rocks, okay? It takes a lot of chewing to really understand what he's talking about, okay? And I'm going to hopefully make it easier for you when we talk about Bulverism here later on. This is the part 3, which has Bulverism we're going to talk about tonight, plus the other 9 topics there. Okay? And now we're going to talk about the transmission of Christianity. Now, as I said, some of you guys here are either are thinking about it, will be thinking about the transmission of Christianity. And so the setting in this particular topic starts with, and mind you, a little history. This particular article is, or write-up of Lewis is found in the preface of the book by B.G. Sandhurst called How Heathen is Britain, okay, published in 1946. And so this is an individual surveying the status of education in Britain and asking the question, how heathen is Britain? Specifically, he's attempting to discover the views of young men in school what are their views about Christianity, and what do they think about the Godhead of Christ, okay? And so C.S. Lewis wrote the preface for this book here. And I would tell you, when you read this particular article, my first thought was, if you're going to ask C.S. Lewis to write the preface for your book here, be careful, because he's very frank. And I guess the question you might want to ask is, hey, C.S. Lewis, you're going to write, I would almost ask him first, are you going to write something good about my book? And C.S. Lewis will probably say, let me read the book first and I'll tell you. Okay. He's not going to give you, I like you, you're a friend. No, he's going to be very honest about what he's writing about. And so in this particular book, he makes 2 observations. And this is 1946 England. He's saying, Christianity is not being taught or defended in our schools. Okay? So think about it. We think about 1946, a long time ago. Things are relatively Christian. Now think about it. There's a mirror of what's going on in England, also in the United States here. We think about the 40s being a relatively mild Christian time here. Okay? But his observation is Christianity is not being taught or defended in education. Okay? He also makes the observation that when Christianity is presented in the educational setting, most people accept what's being taught, which is a good thing, okay? And I want you guys to think about the context of where we are, especially where you are, and you want to educate your kids here. Most of you are going to either homeschool, I would think. Anybody thinking about homeschooling at all? Okay, that's one element. Anybody thinking about a private school? Okay, that's another element. Okay, and then you obviously have public schools. And so in this particular setting here, C.S. Lewis makes the point that if you're going to teach your kids here, teachers can only teach their kids what they know and what they have. Okay, and I'll say this to you, when we educated our kids here, I don't know that we did a very serious job. It was a reasonable job, but I want to almost, if I were doing this over again, I probably would be interviewing the teachers of the school my kids were in. Okay, it's one thing to interview the administration, okay, which is what mostly happens if you're in a private Christian school. Even you usually talk to the administration, and what they typically tell you is, hey, yes, we're a Christian school here, we value your kids here, the Bible's in, all these things that are important. But C.S. Lewis's point is, the teacher themselves are the one giving your kids what they know. And even for you people who are going to think about homeschooling, you can only teach what you know, which should be a little scary, okay? Because there's a lot of things out there that we just don't know. I was talking to my nephew this week here. He was wrapping up with his son's math class. Now this kid's pretty bright. He could handle the 6th grade algebra that he was doing. But my point here, how far can you go as far as what you know to teach your kids here? You got to think about that, okay? Say it again? Well, I hear you saying that, but if you don't know it, you can't teach it, and how are you going to learn it, right?
Well, that's what I'm saying. You can learn it, and then you can teach it.
Tell me what that looks like for you.
So I'm terrible at math.
Okay.
Atrocious. But I plan on homeschooling my kids. So I'm going to do what's necessary in order to help them. And now, if I reach a certain point where it's beyond my pay grade, I can outsource that.
I think you're hitting on the very point here. There are some things you're going to have to outsource. And that's really the point there.
But I'm saying you can learn anything. That's what I'm saying.
I hear you, Annalise, here. I think, let's talk in 5 years. Yeah. No, and it's a good thing to be homeschooled, but you got to be ready is really the point there. You just don't push a button and you're ready, is really my point there. And I'd almost take a deviation here. C.S. Lewis had the blessing of having a mom who taught him both French and Latin, okay? And if you understand one of the benefits of C.S. Lewis here, he was well read. And I would tell you, he after he graduated from Oxford, his first degree, he went so fast on his second degree because he'd already read the coursework in his lifetime. So he was a sponge, okay, but also very well read here. But I think to the point here, C.S. Lewis is making the point that if you're going to be talking about educating people here, make sure you have Christian educators, okay, and make sure you know what they know about Christianity is really part of the point here. He also observed that when you look at a 1940s setting, I never thought about this here, but the teachers of today were educated 20 years ago or about, okay? And so you almost have to look back and say, what were they learning in 1920? And C.S. Lewis's observation is the teachers who were teaching today were educated back in the 1920s, and since they're not transmitting Christianity, they probably didn't have it back there, okay? And so that's where I go back to, you got to really look at who's educating your kids here and what did they learn. Even asking them where did you go to school might be a very reasonable point here. Another point that was made from C.S. Lewis is the fact that when we talk about education and think about transforming our society here, is education the place to really key in on? And so I want to talk about that for a second. If you wanted to transform, let's just say Scottsdale here, do you think it's through education, making sure the schools have a Christian, let's just say a Christian class on Christianity? Any thoughts about that? How would you transform Scottsdale or the greater Phoenix area when it comes to transforming the society for Christianity? And I say this because C.S. Lewis has a thought here, and I think he actually lived it out here. Any thoughts on that? I think most of us would say education, right? Start early, get them while they're young, and if you will, baptize them that way in terms of the knowledge here. C.S. Lewis thought actually adults, right? Target the adults here. In fact, he says, like I said, most people think that the education is the key position for spreading Christianity. He says this is false in the sense that in order to teach Christianity, right, you have to be a Christian in order to do it, okay? And so interfering with schools, altering the curricula, and the like are not the right way to do it, was his thought, which I think is really the means I've typically seen here. Let's look at the curricula, right? Let's have a Christian influence in the schools here. He's saying, go ahead, Dan. Say it again. What's that? Louder. I think the thing is, if you get the adults, now they have an influence, almost like we're talking about here, over the kids and their education. They're probably not. They're not. Are you saying they're not mutually exclusive, or you could do both? Yes. Yes. And I think what you had here is people really focusing on just the kids, though. And think about what C.S. Lewis did here. He's on BBC on a radio show, educating all of England here about Christianity, right? And so these are some of the things he's writing in articles in journals here talking about Christianity. Those are targeting primarily adults, okay? So again, one of the points I want to say, as the teacher is, so the teacher will teach. That's the take-home message here. So when you're thinking about teaching here, what do I have in my bag to teach my kids is really something we should all be thinking about. All right, I'm going to jump on to Bowlerism. Okay, how many of you have heard the word Bowlerism before? Okay, this is a word that C.S. Lewis made up. And if you were here last time, C.S. Lewis and his brother, in their creative imagination, I want to say they were less than 10 years old here, created their own country, right? As little kids here, and published a book here. It wasn't published by them directly here, but what they imagined as little kids here was eventually published. And so you see in C.S. Lewis quite an imagination. And so when we talk about Bowlerism, what I like about this, and I want to thank David here, because I remember talking to you about Sigmund Freud, and how we should be challenging some of the thinking of Sigmund Freud. Anybody gone through any classes where Sigmund Freud was taught in psychology? Okay. Now, I remember when I was in school, a couple years ago, and C.S. Lewis was taught, and I'm listening to this, and I'm thinking, what the freak is this stuff? Because the teacher was teaching it as if it was gospel fact. And I just remember how uncomfortable it made me as a Christian, thinking this is indeed the truth here, but it was very confusing for me as a young person. And so what I like about this particular element here, C.S. Lewis is actually taking on Sigmund Freud, and we'll read about how he's doing that. And so Bowlerism, in this particular book, we have the longer version in this book here. There is a shorter version of this particular article, which appeared in a publication called Notes on the Way in Time and Tide. And I want to start, I want to start this way here with a bit of a fun approach here. Keeping in mind, for those of you who were here last week here, C.S. Lewis was very insistent on the importance of communication when we're talking to a group, right? But also realizing that given some of the limitations of English, one of the challenges, it has two vocabularies, like we said, English and Latin, right? And two, we don't keep a tight control on our English language like the French do with the French Academy. Bowlerism is something that I should say, going back to the 1920s here, proliferated, okay? And so I want to ask you a question here. This is a make-believe here. I want you to imagine for a second that I walked into David's office, and I said, hey, David, I know you're concerned about the budgeting for next year, but we have enough money in the bank to do that Bora Bora mission trip that you wanted to do, okay? And so as I'm talking to David, I want you to imagine for a second that Bill says to me, Tim, that's just wishful thinking, okay? And so my question for you, what is wrong with Bill's response here? I want you to hold that for yourself here, but again, I said there's money in the bank, Okay, I added the numbers up, right? Told David there's enough money in the bank. Hey, you can do your trip to Bora Bora. Okay. Bill, who's listening, says, Tim, that's just wishful thinking. Okay? So just hold that thought there. And I want to read something here because this is if you want some good reading and if you appreciate your education from Freud, I would suggest reading this one before you go to bed. And hopefully you'll enjoy it tonight here with what I just said. So bear with me here. This is at the very beginning on page 299 on Bulverism. It is a disastrous discovery, as Emerson says somewhere, that we exist. I mean, it is disastrous when instead of merely attending to a rose, we are forced to think of ourselves looking at the rose with a certain type of mind and a certain type of eyes. It is disastrous because if you're not very careful, the color of the rose gets attributed to our optic nerves and it's sent to our noses. And in the end, there is nothing left of the rose. Okay? So this is sort of psychoanalysis going on here. Okay? You're looking at a rose, and the psychoanalysis tells you, hey, listen, you forget the rose here a little bit. Okay? Let me continue on here. The professional philosophers have been bothered about this universal blackout over 200 years, and the world has not much listened to them. But the same disaster is now occurring on a level that we all understand. We have recently discovered that we exist in two senses. The Freudians have discovered that we exist as a bundle of complexes. The Marxians have discovered that we exist as members of some economic class. In the old days, it was supposed that if a thing seemed obviously true to 100 men, then it was probably true. Nowadays, Freudian will tell you to go and analyze the 100, you will find that they all think that Elizabeth, the great queen, they all think Elizabeth a great queen because they all have a mother complex. Their thoughts are psychologically tainted at the source. And the Marxists will tell you to go and examine the economic interest of the 100, and you will find that they all think freedom a good thing because they are all members of the bourgeois, whose prosperity is increased by a policy of laissez-faire. Their thoughts are ideologically tainted at the source. And so this is the thinking going on here, okay? And so the question we want to ask ourselves is, this thinking is still, this thinking is still pretty prevalent today. I don't know if you get it. Does anybody know what a genetic fallacy is? You ever heard genetic fallacy? If I said, please.
I thought it's where an argument rests on the source of its claim, the source of
Right. So if I said all men can, you can work on a car because you're a man, that's perhaps a genetic fallacy. Right? You might be a man, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can work on a car. If I says because you're a woman you can cook, that's a genetic fallacy, right? Okay. And so there's some genetic fallacy thinking going on here for the Marxists and the Freudian, okay? And I'll talk about how this relates to Bulverism in a second here. C.S. Lewis goes on to make the point here. There are two questions that people who say this kind of thing ought to be asked. The first is, are all thoughts thus tainted at the source, or only some? The second is, does the taint invalidate the tainted thought in the sense of making it untrue or not? Okay? And so that's a question you want to ask if you're hearing this type of thinking going on. And I want to read this here because this is the definition of Bulverism. In other words, and here's the point, because I think we hear this all the time in argumentation here. Listen carefully. You must show that a man is wrong before you start explaining why he is wrong. Okay? You must show a man is wrong before you start explaining why he is wrong. Does that make sense? So it's one thing to say you're wrong. Go back to my statement here about the math and David here, right? Bill makes the statement, Tim, that's wishful thinking. Okay? Bill never took the time to look at my math and say, you know what, Tim, you're right here. We got a windfall here. Okay, he made a statement, wishful thinking, without proving that I was actually wrong. Okay, so that's we see that a lot in debate here. Did you actually prove what you're asserting here? And a lot of times we don't. Let me finish reading here. In other words, you must show that a man is wrong before you start explaining he is wrong. The modern method to assume without discussion that he is wrong and then distract his attention from this, the only real issue, by busily explaining how he came to be so silly. In the course of the last 15 years, I have found this vice so common that I've had to invent a name for it. It's called Bulverism. Someday I'm going to write a biography of its imaginary inventor, Ezekiel Bulver, whose destiny was determined at the age of 5 when he heard his mother say to his father, who had been maintaining that two sides of a triangle were together greater than the third, and she said, "Oh, you say that because you are a man." At that moment, E. Bulver assures us that there flashed across my opening mind a great truth that refutation is no necessary part of the argument. Assume that your opponent is wrong, and then explain his error, and the world will be at your feet. So think about that. We assume our opponent is wrong, right, for whatever point. Let me get this back on here. And the world follows you, but you haven't proved anything. Think about our politics today, guys. When we say something about somebody, and we assume that they're wrong here, depending on what side of the aisle you're on, most of us just believe it without having any evidence to that point there. It's an easy way to win an argument here, but are you really getting anywhere? Okay. Let's see here. Here's the point he wants to drive home here as far as the solution. Until Bulverism is crushed, reason can only play an effective part in human affairs. Each side of the argument snatches it early as a weapon against the other, but between the two, reason itself is discredited. And why should reason not be discredited? It would be easy in answer to point to the present state of the world, but the real answer is even more immediate. The forces discrediting reason themselves depend on reason. You must reason even to bulverize. When you are trying to prove that all proofs are invalid, if you fail, you fail. But if you succeed, then you fail even more. For the proof that all proofs are invalid must be invalid itself. And so my question, do you guys see Bulverism in the world today? Okay. Go ahead.
I think you did an excellent job of this. I totally agree with you. If you're going to read C.S. Lewis, read God in the Dock. And if you're going to read one thing from God in the Dock, read this. I remember reading it in seminary, and not only it explaining, as you did so well, all of the debate that's going on right now. You're wrong because you're a liberal, because you're an Anglican, because you're Reformed. It's every argument, including by people we like, right? You're wrong because you're a Democrat, whatever. But it was happening in the debates between students on seminary. Like you'd see people, young guys that or guys my age I really respected, but doing this, attacking the person rather than the argument, right? Creating a context where whatever, and a kind of, Bulverism is such a perfect encapsulation of it. What we now call gaslighting makes up half of Bulver.
Good point, good point.
So I think the gaslighting is just part of the problem, but we do that because then any argument I make is more proof that I am a liberal and that I'm wrong. And he does such a good job. You're not listening to anything I'm saying. You're creating a context where whatever I tell you proves that I'm already a Bulverist, and now I'm silenced.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's not only writ large in a bad way in like political debate, economic debate, but I think inside of American Christendom,
It's
all the time,
yeah.
right? You're in the wrong denomination.
1946. Yeah.
Right, 1946.
Yeah. Well, I think we should. I thought about this. Someone I admire says, Tim, the way you used to get your news is in a journal.
Yeah.
And when you got your news in a journal, let's say it's a quarterly or maybe a monthly journal, in that particular journal is the story of a man who, let's say he killed his neighbor, okay? He was arrested by the cops. He went to trial. He was found innocent, right? And the story ends. The way we get our news now is there's a guy who killed his neighbor, and that's sensationalized. You may not even follow up to know if he went to trial and was actually guilty or not, because the guilty, or in this case, the innocence doesn't really sell papers. And I say that because we live in a time of sensationalism, and Bulverism really caters to sensationalism. That's wishful thinking, right? David could have ended right there and says, I guess when I'm not going to Bora Bora. And I could have gone home because, you know what, Bill hurt my feelings here because he said I'm a wishful thinker here, without any evidence. And so I think we got to get to the point of really looking for the evidence, and it's hard, okay? Because we live in such a fast-paced society. And honestly, as he talks about reason being the antidote for Bulverism, the question is, do we want to take the time and ask what are the reasons that you're saying that? And that's why I tie this back to Christianity, C.S. Lewis's comment on communication, in the sense that we should be the ones asking, what are your reasons for saying that, right? So me turning to Bill and say, listen, I did the math here. What are your reasons for saying this wishful thinking on my part? And handing him the document to say, prove me wrong, right? That's a good way. That's a good way to develop the reasons and not be Bulveristic, if you will. Okay? So think about this, because yes, please.
I also just a little bit on the Freud and Marx thing. I think that's really, really helpful, actually, in evangelism. When you're talking to a non-Christian, you are probably talking to a Freudian or a Marxist.
Yes.
And they don't know it.
Right.
But the way they frame their questions will show you, right? Even their objections to Christianity. A great example of this is I like to ask people, what happened at the resurrection? Like, where's the body? Right? And people will usually give you one of two answers. One is, oh, it was a mass hallucination. All those people back then they really wanted to happen, and they all imagined the same thing. That's Freudianism. You're
Right, right,
deconstructing the person
right.
to come up with an insane answer.
Right.
If 5,000 people had the exact same hallucination, I'm not sure that's less of a miracle than someone coming back from the dead.
Right.
Or they'll say it was a systematic lie to get people to gain power. That's Marxist.
Yes.
But those are the two answers you hear about the resurrection. And so it just really downplays how much people now have been trained not to do reason like you're saying, but to find reasons to not reason.
Well, I think you're hitting on the point of the idiocy of it all. Okay.
Right.
And C.S. Lewis makes this point: the sheer self-contradicting idiocy of it all. And so think about this, guys, because as we're in the Christmas season, I was listening to a lot of Handel's Messiah, and think about the importance of the resurrection. Okay, I wouldn't be standing here if we didn't have a resurrection. Okay, it's as C.S. Lewis says, it's the evolution of humanity. It's the ultimate. And so for someone with a Freudian or a Marxian thought, refuting it, right, on bad premise here, how are we going to engage them? Okay, what are the reasons for why we think about what we think here? And then to David's point, taking it back to history to say, well, listen, if 5,000 people had an hallucination here, that's better than Woodstock, where people were hallucinating, if you think about it, okay? Anyway, all right. Any other questions? I'm gonna go to a video here. This particular video is gonna go into. I don't want to steal the thunder here. Let's see.